Here we are back at another episode of If It Be Your Will podcast, and we're in season three now. We're kind of getting our feet under us slowly here in this chilly North Coast, East Coast weather. Um, However, we're going to get a lot of warmth in our hearts today, talking today with my really special guest, Jeffrey Lewis, who extreme singer-songwriter, graphic artist, uh, comic creator, I guess we should say. I guess it's a graphic artist, eh, Jeffrey? It's like
Yeah. Um, that's a lexical gap. I was never happy with trying to figure out how to say comic book maker.
right,
That's too many syllables. But uh, yeah, there isn't really a satisfying word for somebody who writes and draws comics. Somebody needs to come up with a simple word for that. I
yes,
mean, a lot of people are fond of saying cartoonist. But
right,
that sounds almost misleading because I don't feel like what I make. I don't feel like I make cartoons.
right, right.
Um, but cartoonist has become sort of the current acceptable term for an alternative comic book creator.
Well, I
Uh,
accept that term. I think that that's a fine term for sure. Um, Jeffrey, I kind of like starting off these moments in time that we share together with kind of a little look back in time. Um, and like, where did you get started? Like, and I guess you have music and you have your art that kind of fuse together. But did one start more than the other when you were first starting off with your art?
well, I was always into drawing and making comics since I was a little kid. Um, I was just really into reading comics. I didn't have a television in the house. My parents were sort of bohemian hippie types.
Hmm.
So there was no war toys, no television, and comic books was like my main form of entertainment from a very young age, even before I knew how to read.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was just sort of natural to think, I want to be a comic artist when I grow up. It just seemed like a cool thing to do.
Hmm.
And for some reason, I've remained like in the enslavement of that 6-year-old kid who thought that would be a cool thing for grown up Jeffrey to do. So just, I don't know why I need to listen to him, but that little kid for some reason
The dominant
dictated that
voice.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, surely a grown up should have a say in these things. But I didn't start getting into making these songs until after I got out of college when I was like 21, 22.
Hmm.
And I was trying to get work as an illustrator, and I was making my comic books and selling them any chance I could. I would get them, into little zine stores, or I would sell my comics in Washington Square Park. I would just approach strangers and ask if they wanted to buy a homemade comic book.
Hmm.
And I was selling my comics like at Grateful Dead shows and things like that. I just would try to sell my art in whatever ways I
Right.
could. And but then meanwhile, I sort of discovered that there was this open mic on Monday nights, and I could go hang out there. And I would always draw all the performers. I would just sit there with my sketchbook every Monday night,
Hmm.
and I started signing up to play my own songs at the open mic nights. So
Hmm.
I just became a weekly regular there,
Hmm.
making up songs, playing songs, and just and trying to sell my comics there.
Right. Right. What were some of your early themes in your comics when you were that younger child that lives inside your head? How, like, what were the themes that you would dabble in?
Well, I guess some of the first uh, really like extended comic stories that I made, like when I was about 11 or 12, I was super into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm.
And this was like before it had turned into a cartoon. This was when it was just a black and white comic book. That was a really big phenomenon among uh, comic book buyers
Hmm.
in that era. They sort of became this tremendous force in the comic book world. And it wasn't till a couple years later that it crossed over and they got pitched as a cartoon series, and then that turned into the toys and movies and everything else. It
Right.
was just
Right.
kind of like it started out as just something that if you were in the know, um, it was. So I was very inspired by that, and I had a team of superhero squirrels because there were a lot of squirrels around my parents' apartment, and in New York City, there I would always see a lot of squirrels around and the trees and stuff. So I had this team of samurai squirrels that were like a ripoff of the Ninja Turtles. Um,
Fun.
so I
Do you
actually
remember
did.
any of their names? Do you like
Uh,
who was the big guy in your crew?
uh, Colin and Kurt, and of course there were four of them, just like the Turtles.
Yeah.
And uh, I don't remember the other names, but
Right.
I actually did like 5 full issues that were big issues. They were, they weren't even like little 20-page issues. They might have had 40 or 50 pages each.
Mm.
Some of that stuff I still have. I wish I had all of it. I don't know where the rest of it went,
Right.
but that was,
This
some of the
was a
first like,
time before digital, right? So
oh yeah, well, I
storing
mean
it
this is
like
like in
it's
the
all physical stuff, right? It's
yeah,
paper
I'm talking about like 1985,
right,
86.
right,
Um, so at that time, I wasn't even making copies of the comics. It was just like you would draw it and then you would just show it to anybody that you could show it to.
hmm,
And then when I got a little older, um, well, then in high school, I would be making comics. I had of people like I had this team of like very violent superheroes that would like slaughter my teachers and stuff like that, and I would do all these comics about my teachers getting killed and uh,
Was
things like
school
that.
not a happy place? School was
No, I mean I think
tricky.
that's probably. I mean I wasn't like one of the worst kids, but
Hmm,
I think if that stuff had been seen or discovered. I mean, this was like the era before everybody freaking out about
right,
school shooters and stuff, but
sure, sure.
that was definitely things that would happen in my comics was a lot of shooting and slaughtering and chopping up and these kind of I mean they were always kind of tongue in cheek and like
Sure. Yeah.
it was done somewhat humorously uh but yeah, and then I guess in college I got into the more sort of alternative comic stuff of the 90s era.
Hmm.
Dan Clowes, 8 Ball Comics, and Joe Matt's Peep Show comic made a really big difference to me because that was like he made a lot of work about how much of a loser he was and like how lonely he was, or just all of his disgusting habits of like pissing in a kitchen sink or picking his nose or something. And that was like a real revelation that you could just sort of turn yourself inside out in a creative format, and that all the things that you thought were the worst things about you could actually make for really great entertaining art, and it could take all the worst aspects of your life
Hmm,
and turn them into something valuable rather than something that was negative.
right,
So that really fed into my early experience of learning how to make songs. It was like,
right,
oh,
right.
you don't have to like act like you're cool or and then discovering, that was sort of simultaneous with discovering Daniel Johnston. That was also like the biggest life changing thing that really impacted my whole perception of music and
Yeah.
creativity. So that was sort of when I started making and recording songs, was with the influence of Daniel Johnston,
Well,
um, who I didn't even know was into drawing and comic books
right.
himself at that time. And then I guess I later learned that he was also like an illustrator and really into comic books.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, I love how you said that where you kind of straddle that um wit and humor with nihilistic tendencies of and I mean I've been kind of leafing through some of your comics that are online, but I've also been deep into your music, and they both play that line, that fine line, which I find, some of your songs are outright hilarious, but with these really tragic undertones. But they're the way you place lyrics together and words together make it so fascinating. Um, Tell me about, so your start. I read that you started in open mic nights in Austin, Texas,
Well,
back at the turn of the century, like in 2000s. Is that where you started to actually put yourself up on stage and play your songs for people?
It's not an entirely accurate chronology, but I know that there's some of these things have like gotten around on the internet for, I think maybe on my Wikipedia page it says something, or there's like, I had started playing at the open mics in New York in 1998, and I recorded my first cassette of songs in 1998, and I continued doing that all through 1998 and all through 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sort of selling these tapes of my songs and playing both at the open mic nights in New York City, and also I started to get more and more opportunities to play concerts, like little shows at little places, and people would I started to sort of make friends in the music scene and have more opportunities to play shows. And then late in 2000, in November of the year 2000, I moved to Austin, Texas, or I thought maybe I would move to Austin. I just took a Greyhound bus to Austin from New York, and I wanted to just see what would happen if I went to a city where I didn't know anybody and I didn't know anything,
Okay.
and whether I could try to make a life for myself, because I'd lived my whole life in New York City,
Right.
And now that I was like meeting all these people who were playing music, a lot of them had come to New York City in this very brave way. Like my friend Gray Revell, who was a songwriter I really liked at the open mic. He had come from Los Angeles, and he didn't know anybody in New York City. He had no money. He just took his guitar and got on a bus and showed up in New York City. And I just thought that was such a great adventure and sounded so exciting. So I was like, where can I go to have that same kind of experience of just starting from zero? And Austin appealed to me because it was a city that I had no experience of at all. I had previously already like traveled through Chicago and San Francisco and Seattle and a lot of the other American cities, but Austin was a place I'd never been, where I really could have that experience of just knowing nothing and knowing nobody. Plus, it had the element that that's where Daniel Johnston had sort of gotten originally known, and where he had come out of with his cassettes in the 80s. So it was like a little bit of a pilgrimage to, the Daniel Johnston hometown.
Yeah. No.
So when I was in Austin, I was trying to, play at open mic nights and continuing to try to, make my comics and sell my comics and try to figure out how I could play shows and how I could do freelance illustration jobs for local businesses. And I was just continuing my kind of starving artist life. But it was while I was there that, meanwhile, back in New York City, a lot of exciting things were happening for people that I knew in New York. The Moldy Peaches got signed to Rough Trade Records in England at that time, and they started to become very successful and get a lot of media attention, and really were building up a significant fan base. And Rough Trade Records had asked the Moldy Peaches, like, do you know anybody else in the New York City scene that you would recommend that we look into? And to my eternal gratitude, they were like, yeah, you should check out Jeffrey Lewis. And they made a CD of some of my songs, and they gave it to Jeff Travis, the head of Rough Trade Records. And this was like probably something that if I had been there in New York, I probably would have screwed that up in some way. I would have said or done the wrong thing. But the fact that it had nothing to do, I didn't even know this was going on. And they were able to, Adam and Kim, you have the Moldy Peaches, were able to sort of curate my stuff, which was only on cassette at that time. They like sort of took some of the songs that they thought were the best ones, and they put them on a CD, I guess, and they gave them to Rough Trade Records. So I got this email while I was still living in Austin from Rough Trade, and that was like, we've heard some of your stuff. Would you be interested in releasing this? So that was like that really made a huge difference in my life, to have this opportunity to have these home recordings come out on a significant record label with significant exposure in England at that time. So that happened in 2001, and that really kind of made a really big difference in my life. That suddenly it was like I wasn't just some guy selling cassettes for $3 at an open mic. Somehow, through very random circumstance, I had a CD that was out on Rough Trade Records in England. It didn't really they didn't really have much of an operation in America at first.
Right.
They did a little later.
Right.
Um,
What was
so
that
yeah,
first record, that
yeah.
first CD called that you got? What was signed? What was the title of that one?
So that one was called "The Last Time I Did Acid, I Went Insane" and Other Favorites, and that ended up coming out on Rough Trade in September of 2001. And at that time, a woman that I'd been dating in New York was doing a semester studying in London, so I was able to go with my brother Jack and visit my girlfriend in London. And we stayed with her in London for about a week, or maybe a little longer, and I was able to do a couple of very small gigs with my brother while we were in London because the album had already come out in England.
Right.
And that was like my first experience of playing to people that I didn't know personally. That was like the first time to play a show and there were people in the audience that had just heard of this record, or they had read a review of it, or they bought the record. And that was really incredible to be like, oh, like people like this stuff that are not just like my friends coming to my gigs or something. Even though these were very small shows, it was kind of it was really mind blowing to just be like, to kind of feel like, we had made it in this way. My brother Jack and I were playing music together a lot at that time. And then that also led to more opportunities because in the audience at one of those gigs was Ben Ayers, who was the guitarist in this band Corner Shop. And they were booking a tour at that time. They were planning to tour in early 2002. So Ben was like, oh, I really love the performance you did. Would you be an opening act on this Corner Shop tour? So that really threw me in at like the deep end of the swimming pool. And so early 2002, I ended up doing all these shows opening for Corner Shop, playing to pretty big audiences, 600 people, 700 people. And I was, completely out of my element. I probably had no idea what a sound check was, what a monitor was, what a green room was, what a merch table was, all the kind of, music biz touring info. That was a real educational experience. And I'm, very grateful to Corner Shop for taking a chance on me.
Absolutely.
But I was just too amateurish to really capitalize on that because it wasn't like I could go back and play those places again myself. It was like it was too many levels removed from where I was at to be able to like do that.
Right.
But
what were those early shows like, Jeffrey? Like, like what were the feel to those shows when you first went overseas and were playing in front of people that knew or knew of the music that you were making? What was that experience like for you?
It was just incredible. I just like could barely sing because I was like, I couldn't wipe the smile off my face. It was just so exciting. It was just unbelievable. I mean, it was like, maybe there were 15 people in the room, but it was like 15 people that I didn't know personally that were excited to see me and hear these songs. And that was just, that was like, it was one of the happiest, most exciting experiences that I've had.
Do you remember like in the crowd, like seeing people sing along with you? Like, did that happen during those early tours where people would actually know the lyrics to your songs?
People knew, there was, and people would ask for autographs and stuff. It was like, but I really benefited from the tremendous, the success and the outreach of the Moldy Peaches really benefited me quite a lot because the Moldy Peaches were all the press about them and in interviews and stuff. They talked about how they were part of the so-called New York anti-folk scene.
Right.
And it really got a lot of people curious about what is New York anti-folk. And when they were curious about that, it was like, oh, well, there's this guy, Jeffrey, if you like this stuff, where else are you going to, the next thing that you would check out would be my stuff. So I kind of got this kind of runoff effect. I basically just kind of rode their coattails.
Well, I mean, your songwriting is superior. I mean, you have an amazing grasp on lyric and music. I wanted to ask you, what is like, I know anti folk, it's the term, like indie pop or whatever it like to you, what does that mean? Like, what is that? How does that represent the style that you play?
Well, I never heard the phrase anti-folk when I started making these songs.
Right.
And when I started hanging out at the Sidewalk Cafe and playing at the open mic, um, people started saying like, "Oh, Sidewalk Cafe, home of the anti-folk scene," and
Hmm.
if you were playing at Sidewalk, you were considered part of the anti-folk scene, and um, you would be asked to perform at the Sidewalk Anti-Folk Festival every
Right.
year, and there was a little fanzine there called Anti-Matters that would come out once a month, and they would have interviews with people that played at Sidewalk, and they would have reviews of people's albums, and it would be like, what's going on in the world of anti-folk, and it was just this little self-contained scene. I mean, Sidewalk
Right.
probably fit a maximum of about 75 people or 70 people. It was like a small room,
Right.
but because it sort of had its own phrase for itself, like this is the anti-folk scene, and here's the little
Hmm.
zine Antimatters about the anti-folk scene, and we're going to have the anti-folk festival. Do you want to play a set at the anti-folk festival? It was like its own little self-contained, self-invented world,
Hmm.
and it was like it was really fun to just be a part of that.
Right.
Stylistically, it didn't make a whole lot of sense because basically anybody who played at Sidewalk, no matter what kind of music they played, was considered to be anti-folk and part of the anti-folk scene.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
ironically, I feel like what I was doing kind of almost made more sense for that phrase than what most other people were doing.
Hmm.
I feel like this idea of anti-folk maybe makes more sense for the kind of lo-fi stuff that I was making, and the
Hmm.
stuff that I was making with my brother Jack uh, kind of fits that description more than what a lot of people at Sidewalk were doing.
Right.
So, uh, on one hand, it just means anybody who ever played at Sidewalk Cafe. Um, and on the other hand, it has some kind of stylistic element of
Hmm.
mixing folk, punk, lo-fi, uh, something like that. And then when the Moldy Peaches came along a little later, they also, even though they had already been playing shows on the West Coast and they had existed prior to playing at Sidewalk, they just fit right into that
Hmm.
thing better than anybody else had before. I mean, the anti-folk scene had been going on for 15 years at that point. And
Right.
then when the Moldy Peaches showed up, it was like, oh, that's what anti-folk is all about. And they had never heard of it, but it was like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. Right. And I mean, recently listened to the collaboration you did with Kimia Dawson from the Moldy Peaches, The Bundles. You had a release that came out in 2010. What was that whole experience like working with Kimia and collaborating with somebody, from another band that you had listened to and admired and kind of helped you along the way a little bit? Like, what was that collaboration with her?
Well, that actually started before a lot of this other stuff happened.
Hmm.
Like when I had moved to Austin uh, in late 2000, Kimya was one of the friends of mine from New York that I was still in like pen pal contact with, because these were like it was kind of the early days of using email, and I was mostly still writing a lot of letters.
Hmm.
So Kimya and I would write a lot of letters back and forth, and um, we had not hung out a whole lot in New York. We'd hung out a little bit in New York, and I was actually at her first ever solo performance because everybody kind of knew her as like, oh, she's the person who plays with Adam in the Moldy Peaches, but
Hmm.
she didn't yet have a solo thing going on,
Hmm.
and she had said that she was going to play a little solo show in the Bronx, and I think it was her first ever time playing solo, and I went there with some friends to see her, and there were maybe like 5 people in the room, and we were all just utterly flabbergasted. Like it was the first time that anybody had heard. I guess I don't know how long she had been working on that first batch of her solo songs,
Right.
but it was just pretty shocking. It was like, oh my god, like this is 5 levels beyond any kind of songwriting that I've ever heard anybody do, and it was. It was just a pretty staggering experience to be like, Oh, she's not just the person who backs up Adam in the Moldy Peaches. She's
Right.
like the best songwriter I've ever heard.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so we stayed in contact, and she came to visit me when I was in Austin, because she knew that I was like super lonely down there, and she was also like me. She was a fan of just taking random trips on a Greyhound bus, and she wasn't scared of being on a bus for 3 days and nights. And she did that sort of thing quite a lot herself.
Mm.
So she was like, it just sounded like fun to her to take a bus down and visit me in Austin. So, uh, yeah, early in 2001, she did visit me for about a week in Austin, and during that time, we made up a bunch of songs together,
Mm.
which was kind of her way of thinking of a fun way for us to hang out. Because although we'd been pen pals, we hadn't really spent that much time hanging out in person. And
Right.
these kind of collaborative songs were just kind of like a really fun way to just hang out with somebody. Like, hey, let's make up a song together. Like,
Yeah.
you write a couple verses, I'll write a couple verses. And I had never done, that was sort of very eye-opening that you could hang out with people and make up songs together. And it was like, and of course, because she's such a brilliant songwriter,
Right.
even when she's just messing around, throwing out random lines, I was, really impressed, and just, whatever silly thing we were throwing together, she would just elevate it with all these great ideas, and even great musical ideas. I mean, she's not considered she's considered a very lo-fi musician, but just those simple keyboard parts that she would come up with, they were all just, to me, it was just perfect. I was like, wow, this is exactly the kind of stuff that I think is great. But then but that was way back in 2001, and that was like before I had dealt with Rough Trade. In fact, in a certain way, it was almost like when Kimya saw how pathetic my life was in Austin, and like how broke and lonely my life was, that maybe that even inspired her a little to want to help me and get me signed to Rough Trade, later on when the Moldy Peaches helped make that connection. It might have been something of an act of pity after she saw my lowly circumstances firsthand. I don't know. But anyway, it wasn't until many years later that we had the opportunity to record those songs in a studio. When
those were the songs that you guys had worked on years before.
Yeah. So, went back, a few years later, when Kimya was no longer working with Rough Trade Records, and she was living in the Northwest, and she was releasing records with K Records, which is the great indie label out of Olympia, Washington, Kimya was like, well, why don't you and your brother and your old drummer Anders come out to Olympia? We'll play some shows, and we can record those old songs, because I have access to the K Records recording studio, which wasn't really like a real studio. It was just and also Carl Blau, who's a musician who has records on K Records. He works as the K Records recording person, so he had some microphones and stuff. So he ended up collaborating with us, and we were like, oh, let's make up some, while we're all here together, let's make up a few more songs, including Carl Blau, because he was there to record us. So I think that all happened very rapid. Maybe it even was in one day or like 2 days or something, that we were like, let's make up some new songs. We'll record the old songs together. We'll come up with some parts. Carl, why don't you play keyboard on this or saxophone on that? And let's make up some new songs together. So yeah, so me and Jack and Anders and Carl and Kimya just kind of put that album together very rapidly in the basement of the K Records, using some of the songs that Kimya and I had written in 2001 and some new songs that we just made up there.
Right. Amazing. What a story. I mean, wow. Your stories are so fascinating, Jeffrey. Like, your life experiences, wow, are really interesting. It's great to kind of get this timeline from you. As we kind of wrap up, because we're getting close to our time here, you just put out last July A-sides and B-sides, which is a bunch of material that you hadn't released yet. How did that come to be, and how's the reception been to these new old songs that you just put out?
Well, the reception has been horrible. It was really just an experiment, because I wanted to learn about self-releasing stuff through streaming. I had never, I'd done a little bit during the pandemic. I had obviously a lot of time to experiment with ways I could do stuff just from my apartment.
Right.
So part of that experimentation was, well, I could release some stuff on Bandcamp, or what if I release some stuff on Spotify, or what would happen if I release stuff on Spotify that I don't put on Bandcamp, and what happens if I release stuff on Bandcamp I don't put on Spotify, and what happens if I release stuff, just on whatever, here's something that's just on CD. It's not on my Bandcamp or on my Spotify. And here, so it was just sort of I was just sort of playing around with what would happen if I tried this and tried that. Right. What's more effective? Like what, and the stakes were very low because I was just making recordings at home that didn't cost any money to make. And also I realized I had all of these previously recorded tracks, either from previous studio sessions over the years or things that were left off of albums that were just sitting around on my laptop. And I was like, well, I could release some of those and see what happens. Mm-hmm. So that was, and the title of that album is Asides and B-Sides. It's supposed to be like a pun, like Asides and B-Sides.
Right, I got you. Was it not called Nonsense though when it first came out?
Well, I was learning how to do the so-called waterfall release on Spotify. That's what artists call it when you release one song at a time. Okay. So what you do is you release one song. The first one I released was You're Invited. And then a few weeks later, about 6 weeks later, you release the second song. And I think the second song was What I Love Most in England is the Food. Mm-hmm. And when you release the second song, you include the first song as track number 2. And you delete the first song. So at first, there was just a release called You're Invited. Then I deleted that release and released What I Love Most in England is the Food. And that was a 2-song release, which included What I Love Most in England is the Food and You're Invited. Then a few weeks later, you delete that and you release a 3-song release called Nonsense. And that has Nonsense, You're Invited, and What I Love Most in England is the Food. And so on and so forth. And each time you keep deleting the previous version and putting it up with one new song. And that's supposed to be the most effective modern way to release stuff into the streamosphere. You just keep dropping one song at a time every few weeks, but you can re-include the previous songs. Okay. So then finally that was, I decided to just wrap up that project and be like, okay, here's all of those songs. And I'm just going to call it Asides and B-Sides. And it's a bunch of just previously unreleased material. It's just a bunch of leftover stuff that didn't, it was just sitting around on my laptop. Right. So it's not my best stuff. It was just an experiment. But
I think I love it. I mean, I obsessively listened to it when it first came out.
Well, I'm glad some people like it, but
when that really old cat dies, I mean, what a song. I love that song so much.
Thanks. But what it seems to have done is greatly damage my my algorithmic status by releasing these sort of leftover songs. I was, for a while, I had 120,000 monthly listeners on Spotify, which I guess is a pretty respectable number. I mean, it's not as many as Kimya Dawson or, it's certainly not as many as the Mountain Goats or something like that. But in terms of indie artists, 120,000 monthly listeners is pretty darn good.
Yeah.
But since I started releasing those Asides and B-Sides tracks, every month my monthly listeners would just go down and down and down. And I lost about 30% of my listenership from putting that out. So now I'm down to about 80,000 monthly listeners.
Do you think it might be cyclical though? Because example on my blog, I have that too. Peaks and then big valleys, and then it comes back up higher and then goes down, and then goes back up higher. Anyway,
so far it's just dropping and dropping. So if you own stock in Jeffrey Lewis streaming, you're screwed. But that might be because those songs are not my best material. They were outtake leftover songs. I mean, it's possible that if maybe I can get back on top by releasing, whenever I put my next quote real album out.
Right.
Maybe I'll build back up. But it was that was an interesting
experiment. The streamified experience it's still in the works, still in a big question mark kind of, is it effective or not?
Right.
In your mind.
Well, it was certainly effective in destroying my listenership, which was not supposed to be the effect.
Well, I hope that resurfaces and like all life, it's a circle and comes back around. Um, but Jeffrey, just kind of like wrap things up here. Like, what's coming down the pipe for you over the next, this year, 2024? What's going down?
Well, I recorded a new album with my band a while ago. We actually recorded it a year ago,
Hmm.
and I still have not figured out a release situation. I'm talking to different record labels, and I'm trying to figure out, wait, maybe I should put it out myself. I don't know what the industry and the pros and cons of doing it in different ways is rather confusing. So hopefully that will come out as soon as I can get that out in some way that makes sense to do. And yeah, I'm also experimenting with having my bandmate Mallory. She's been playing violin and keyboard in my band for a couple of years. I'm trying to not spend quite as much time myself doing the tour booking work. So I'm experimenting with having Mallory book some spring tour dates in the southern USA. And sort of in exchange, she's going to be the opening act on that tour. So,
Cool.
So we'll see how that goes. That we'll see if she manages to put the tour together. That'll save me a lot of time, and she'll be happy with that because she'll be able to, she'll be playing sets of her own stuff to open the nights. So that's we're sort of in the early stages of doing that plan, and. Yeah, I would like to be working. I recently released my new comic book issue, Statics issue number 2, came out a couple months ago. So I would like to be working on my new, issue number 3 of my new Statics comic series. So I'm sort of writing some ideas for that new issue. I recorded a bunch of home recordings in 2023 that I might put on Bandcamp soon. I've been doing that the last few years. Like at the end of each year, I kind of put a little batch of home recordings on Bandcamp. Like here's sort of almost like a diary or a sketchbook of all the sort of song demos that I made during the year. So I might compile my 2023 collection soon. I have there's always various stuff.
You're very busy, Jeffrey. Very busy. Which is great. It's great for us because we get to hear your stuff, your music, and read your comics. So I want to thank you for joining me. This has been such a blast. I lost track of time a bit just talking, but I appreciate your joining me and sharing all of these wonderful experiences that you've had as a musician. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and best of luck to you in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy New Year to you, and all the best with your art. And I'll be following you.
Thanks.
I know that everything will get better, then I know that everything will get worse. Who took all the bills in my wallet? Or did I fill it up in reverse? Taking all the chips to the table before they're gonna turn out the light. Seems like it'll never be worth it, but you never know when it might. So I'm taking myself to the cleaners, walking on the only street that I trust. And I'll dig my own grave a bit deeper till I get a diamond out of the dust. Once I didn't have any money, then I had a little success. Once I had a life in the future, now I got a little bit less. Play a slot machine for a living, never have a day to relax. Everything is constantly spinning, clinging to the edge of the tracks. Try to keep a grip on the handle, hoping that it doesn't go bust. I guess I gotta get a little more dirty till I get a diamond out of the dust. Welcome to the palace of paintings, it's incredible to see what it cost. Welcome to the giant casino, built by all the people who lost. I know I'm just a drop in the bucket, but I wanna still make a splash. If I had another leg, I'd be happy. That's one more pocket where there might be some cash. Book myself a room at the dungeon, take the punishment that I must. Working on the loneliest chain gang till till I get a diamond out of the dust. Driving off the side of a mountain, while you're still in the air, it's not wrecked. Take a little look out the window, nothing that I didn't expect. Once I didn't have any chances, then I caught the tropical bug. Once there was a pile of options, then I swept it under the rug. Always had a gambling fever, got squeezed but I never got crushed. Begging for a dime in the darkness, till I get a diamond out of the guts.